As soon as this baby is born, I'm putting you both out on the street. But what the husband did, Emily Carter never imagined that the cruelest words of her life would come from the person who should have supported her during the most delicate moment of her pregnancy. 8 months pregnant and with a heavy body, she was preparing for the arrival of the family's first grandchild. But the reality she faced at home was far different from the dreams she nurtured. It was on a Sunday afternoon that Mrs. Margaret Mitchell, her mother-in-law, spoke the words that made her world crumble. Emily was resting on the living room sofa when the 62-year-old woman approached with a stern face and the cold gaze she knew so well. "As soon as this baby is born, I'm putting you both out on the street," declared Mrs. Margaret, adjusting the pearl necklace around her neck with a frightening calm. Emily felt her blood run cold. Over the past 8 months she had noticed her mother-in-law's growing hostility, but she never expected such a direct and cruel declaration. "What do you mean, Mrs. Margaret?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. "You understood me perfectly, my dear. This house has always been mine, and I decide who stays and who goes, and my decision is made." David Mitchell arrived from work at that moment and found his wife in tears on the sofa and his mother standing with her arms crossed. At 35, he worked as a civil engineer at a construction company in the region and always tried to keep the peace between the two most important women in his life. "What's going on here?" he asked, dropping his work briefcase on the table. "Your mother said she's going to put us out as soon as the baby is born," Emily explained between sobs. David looked at his mother, hoping she would deny it or explain it was a misunderstanding, but Mrs. Margaret kept her serious expression. "It's true, David. It's time for you to build your own life. Mom, Emily is 8 months pregnant. How can you think of something like this now?" "Exactly because of that. A child needs to grow up in their parents' house, not their grandmother's." The argument went on into the night, but Mrs. Margaret remained unyielding. David tried to argue about the young couple's financial difficulties, the costs of a newborn, the lack of time to find a suitable house, but nothing seemed to shake the woman's determination. "You have until the baby is born to get organized," was all she said before retiring to her room. Emily stayed up all night, stroking her belly and wondering how it would be possible to find a place to live on a tight salary with a baby on the way. David tried to comfort her, promising he would find a solution, but she could see the worry written on her husband's face. On Monday, Emily started looking for a job, even with her belly already quite large. She knew it would be almost impossible to get work in that condition, but she had to try. She took buses around the city of Charlotte, visiting stores, offices, any place that might accept an 8-month pregnant woman. The first rejection came from a clothing store downtown. "Look, dear, you seem like a nice person, but how are we supposed to hire someone who will go on leave in a few weeks?" explained the manager with a forced smile. The second was at a small accounting office. "Unfortunately, we're not in a position to handle the employment costs for a pregnant woman at this time," said the accountant, without even looking at her resume. The third, fourth, fifth, all the answers were variations on the same theme. Emily returned home each day more discouraged, her feet swollen and her heart heavy. Mrs. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law's comings and goings with poorly disguised satisfaction. During dinner, she would make seemingly innocent comments. "Did you find anything today, Emily?" "Not yet, Mrs. Margaret. I can imagine. Who would want to hire a woman about to give birth?" David would interfere in these conversations, asking his mother to be more understanding, but she would always counter with arguments about responsibility and independence. A week after the threat, Emily discovered something that left her even more shaken. She had applied for an administrative assistant position at a small company, and the person in charge of human resources seemed interested in hiring her even while pregnant. They scheduled a second interview for Thursday. But on Wednesday, when she went to get the mail, she noticed a letter addressed to her had disappeared. She was sure she had seen her name on a piece of mail the day before, but it was no longer there. "Mrs. Margaret, did you see any letter for me?" she asked. "I didn't see any letter, dear." Later, while Mrs. Margaret was at the market, Emily decided to search the house. In the kitchen trash, she found pieces of a torn-up letter. Patiently, she put the pieces together and managed to read part of the content. It was from the company where she had the second interview, confirming her hiring. When Mrs. Margaret returned from the market, she found Emily in the living room with the pieces of the letter in her hands. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Did what?" "You tore up my job offer letter." Mrs. Margaret put the grocery bags on the floor and straightened her posture, as she always did when confronted. "I was just protecting you from a hasty decision. Working 8 months pregnant? What kind of serious company would do that?" "The decision was mine. It was my only chance to have some income." "Income for what? You're going to leave here anyway." The argument escalated quickly. Emily, for the first time since she had known her mother-in-law, lost her composure and shouted. The stress and pregnancy hormones, combined with the accumulated frustration, exploded into a crisis of tears and despair. That's when David arrived from work and found the scene, his mother with her arms crossed, looking coldly at his wife, who was crying convulsively on the living room floor. "My God, what happened?" He ran to support Emily. "Your mother. She tore up my job offer letter." Emily managed to explain between sobs. David looked at his mother with an expression she had never seen before. There was anger there, a contained but visible anger. "Is this true, Mother? It was a questionable company. No!" he shouted at his mother for the first time in his life. "This is none of your business." David's shout echoed through the house. Mrs. Margaret took a few steps back, surprised by her son's reaction. "David, I only wanted to—" "You crossed a line, Mother. Way over the line." That night, the couple talked late into the night in their bedroom. David was visibly shaken by his mother's behavior, but also conflicted. Mrs. Margaret had raised him alone after his father abandoned them when he was only 8 years old. She had worked 2 jobs to give her son an education, made huge sacrifices, and he felt grateful for all of it. "She wasn't always like this, Emily. My mother is a good woman." "David, she is trying to destroy us. Can't you see that?" "Maybe she's just afraid of being alone. We're the only family she has." Emily wanted to understand her husband's point of view, but the situation was becoming unbearable. The next morning, she woke up with mild contractions. The doctor said they were Braxton Hicks contractions, but recommended rest and less stress. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Margaret, upon hearing about the contractions, showed the first sign of concern since she had made the threat. "How is she?" she asked David. "Having contractions. The doctor said it's because of the stress." The woman remained silent for a few seconds, but then resumed her cold demeanor. "Then she'd better stop looking for a job. There's no point in wearing herself out for nothing." David could no longer understand his mother. The woman who had raised him with so much love and dedication seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone cruel and calculating. He decided to try a different approach. "Mom, let's talk calmly. Explain to me why you're doing this to Emily." "I'm not doing anything to her, David. I've simply made it clear that you need to have your own space." "But why now? Why when she's pregnant?" "Exactly because of that. A child changes everything. You need to learn to be independent." "We've always been independent, Mom. We pay our share of the bills. We take care of our part of the house. We've never been any trouble." "Not trouble, but—" Mrs. Margaret stopped mid-sentence, as if she were about to say something she shouldn't. "But what, Mom?" "Nothing. I just think it's better this way." David realized there was something more behind his mother's attitude, something she wasn't saying. He decided to investigate on his own. On Friday, he pretended to go to work, but returned home mid-morning. Mrs. Margaret had gone out shopping, as she always did on Fridays. David took the opportunity to search his mother's room, something he had never done in his life. In the wardrobe, behind a row of dresses, he found an old shoebox. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, letters, and old photographs. David began to examine the material, trying to understand what it meant. The photographs were from the 1990s and showed children in an institution he didn't recognize. There were several pictures of him when he was little, which was strange as he didn't remember many childhood photos. But what intrigued him most was a photo where he appeared next to a dark-haired girl, both in uniforms. David didn't remember that girl, but there was something familiar about her. He continued rummaging through the box and found official documents. One of them was a temporary custody certificate. His heart raced when he read the child's name, Emily Carter Silver, his wife. His hands trembled as he held the document. Emily had been placed under the temporary custody of his mother when she was 6 years old. How was that possible? How had his own mother never mentioned that she knew Emily before? David heard the gate open and quickly put everything back in the box, returning it to its place. When Mrs. Margaret entered the house, he was in the living room, trying to appear normal. "David, what are you doing home?" "I left work early today. I wanted to see how Emily was doing." "She's sleeping. She had a difficult night." David nodded, but his mind was buzzing with questions. He waited until evening to talk to Emily about what he had discovered. "Emily, do you remember anything from your childhood, from when you were very little?" "Why are you asking that?" "Just curious. You never talk much about when you were a child." Emily sighed, stroking her belly. "I prefer not to think too much about that period, David. They were difficult years. My parents died when I was 5 and I went to live in a children's shelter." "Were you there long?" "A few years. There were a few adoption attempts, but they never worked out. One family took me home for a few months when I was 6, but then they sent me back." David's heart almost stopped. 6 years old. The age on the document. "Do you remember that family?" "Not really. It was a woman and a boy. The boy was nice, he played with me, but the woman, she didn't like me much. She said I was too problematic." David felt a lump in his throat. The woman was his mother, the boy was him. "Problematic how?" "I cried a lot at night. I had nightmares. And I think I asked a lot of questions about my parents. The woman said I was difficult to handle." "And you never saw those people again?" "Never again. I went back to the shelter and stayed there until I turned 18. David spent a sleepless night trying to process this information. His mother had temporarily adopted his future wife when they were children, and then had returned her to the orphanage, claiming she was problematic. The most disturbing thing was that Mrs. Margaret had known who Emily was from the day David brought her home as his girlfriend, and never said a word. On Saturday morning, David confronted his mother while Emily was taking a shower. "Mum, I need you to be honest with me. Did you know Emily before I started dating her?" Mrs. Margaret was preparing breakfast and stopped stirring the eggs in the pan. "What are you talking about? I found the photos, Mom, and the documents." Mrs. Margaret's face paled. She turned off the stove and leaned against the kitchen sink. "You were snooping through my things. You adopted Emily when she was a child, and then you sent her back to the orphanage. David, is that why you're doing all this to her now? Because of what happened in the past?" Mrs. Margaret closed her eyes and sighed deeply. "You don't understand anything about that time. Then explain it to me." "It was 1992. Your father had just left us. I worked days at a factory and nights as a cleaner in an office. You were 8 years old and I was desperate, trying to handle everything alone." David sat at the kitchen table, listening intently. "I knew a social worker from the shelter. She said there was a girl who needed a temporary family, just for a few months until they could find a permanent family for her. I thought it would be good for you to have some company. And what happened? The girl was difficult. She cried every night, woke up screaming from nightmares. You tried to comfort her, but I was at the end of my rope. I worked 16 hours a day, came home and found you both awake, her crying and you trying to take care of her." Mrs. Margaret turned on the faucet and washed her hands, avoiding her son's gaze. "After 6 weeks, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the social worker and said I couldn't care for the girl any longer, that I needed to focus on you, my own son." "And you never thought of her again?" "I did, yes. For years I wondered if I had done the right thing. But I was so young, David. I was only 28, alone, with no money, no support. When I brought Emily home, did you recognize her immediately?" "Mrs. Margaret nodded, her eyes welling up. "The moment I saw her, she grew up, changed, but some features were still the same. And the name, Emily Carter Silver." It was impossible to forget. "Why did you never say anything?" "What was I supposed to say, David?" "Hi, dear, I'm the woman who abandoned you when you were 6. David ran his hands through his hair, trying to process it all. "So that's why you're being cruel to her now?" "I'm not being cruel. You're trying to get rid of her again." Mrs. Margaret turned sharply to her son. "That's not it. It's complicated, David. Seeing her every day, knowing what I did, it's like a weight on my conscience. So the solution is to hurt her even more? I thought it would be better for everyone if you built your own life away from here." "Better for whom, Mom? For her or for you?" Mrs. Margaret didn't answer. Emily appeared in the kitchen at that moment, wearing a robe with her hair still damp. "Good morning," she said, avoiding looking directly at her mother-in-law. "Good morning, love." David stood up and kissed his wife's forehead. "How are you feeling today?" "Better. The baby is calmer." Mrs. Margaret watched the scene in silence. There was something in the way Emily spoke, in her tone of voice, that transported her back to the 1990s. The girl who cried at night had become a kind and strong woman. "I'm going to have coffee outside on the terrace," said Emily, picking up a cup. When they were alone again, David continued the conversation with his mother. "Are you going to tell her?" "Tell her what?" "The truth. That you've known her since she was a child." "I don't see the need. That will only stir up things from the past that are better left alone." "Mom, she has the right to know." "The right to know she was rejected twice in her life by the same person?" The question silenced David. Mrs. Margaret had a point. Telling Emily the truth could be even more painful than the current situation, but keeping this secret didn't seem right either. In the following days, David watched the interaction between the two women with new eyes. He noticed small details that had previously gone unnoticed. How Mrs. Margaret sometimes looked at Emily with an expression that mixed guilt and sadness. How she avoided being alone with her daughter-in-law. How her cruel comments seemed forced, as if she were playing a role. On Tuesday, Emily had another bout of contractions. This time they were stronger and lasted longer. David quickly took her to the hospital, while Mrs. Margaret stayed at home, visibly worried. At the hospital, the doctor explained that the contractions were caused by stress and that Emily needed absolute rest. Any kind of emotional tension could trigger a premature birth, the doctor warned. She is in her 36th week, which is relatively safe, but the ideal would be to reach 38 weeks. When they returned home, Mrs. Margaret was waiting in the living room. "How is she?" she asked, genuinely concerned. "The doctor said she needs complete rest and no stress," David replied, helping Emily sit on the sofa. "I'll stay in the bedroom," said Emily. "I need to get away from anything that causes me tension." The indirect message was clear. Mrs. Margaret lowered her head, understanding that she was the main source of her daughter-in-law's stress. That night, David had a serious talk with his mother. "Mom, you need to stop this." The doctor was clear. Any stress could make the baby come early. "I know, David. I don't want anything to happen to the baby." "Then stop threatening Emily. Stop being hostile to her." Mrs. Margaret was silent for a few minutes. "What if I told her the truth?" she finally said. "Do you think now is the right time for that? With her 8.5 months pregnant? Maybe it's better than continuing to lie. Or maybe it's even worse, Mom. Imagine the shock it would be for her to discover that the person trying to kick her out of the house is the same one who abandoned her in childhood." Mrs. Margaret knew her son was right. The situation seemed to have no solution. On Thursday, Emily fell ill again. This time, besides the contractions, she had light bleeding. David rushed her to the hospital, with Mrs. Margaret in the back seat of the car. During the drive, Emily held David's hand and cried, "I don't want our son to be born like this, with so much tension at home," she said. "Everything will be okay, love. It will all work out." David tried to comfort her, but he was also terrified. Mrs. Margaret, in the back seat, watched the scene and felt her heart tighten. The girl she had returned to the orphanage 30 years ago was there, grown up, pregnant, suffering because of her once again. At the hospital, the doctors managed to stabilize Emily and stop the contractions, but they kept her under observation for 24 hours. In the early hours of the morning, while David slept in a chair next to his wife's bed, Mrs. Margaret stayed awake in the hallway, thinking. There was a coffee machine at the end of the hall, and she went to get a cup to stay alert. That's when she saw Emily wake up and go to the bedroom bathroom. The young woman seemed uncomfortable, leaning against the walls. Mrs. Margaret instinctively stood up to help her, but then stopped, remembering how hostile she had been with her daughter-in-law. Emily noticed her mother-in-law's presence in the hallway and looked at her through the bedroom's glass door. For a few seconds, the two stared at each other. There was something in that gaze that moved Mrs. Margaret. It was the same frightened look the girl had 30 years ago. Mrs. Margaret entered the bedroom and approached her daughter-in-law. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly so as not to wake David. "I am. I just went to the bathroom." "Do you need help getting back to bed?" Emily hesitated for a moment, surprised by her mother-in-law's sudden kindness, but then accepted the support. "Thank you," she said, as she settled back into the hospital bed. "Emily, Mrs. Margaret began, but didn't know how to continue. "What is it, Mrs. Margaret?" "I don't want anything to happen to you or the baby." "Then why are you doing this to us?" Mrs. Margaret sat in the chair next to the bed where David had been sleeping. "It's complicated to explain." "Try. Because I really don't understand what I did to deserve so much hostility." "You didn't do anything, Emily. The problem isn't with you." "Then what is the problem?" Mrs. Margaret took a deep breath. For a moment, she thought about telling the whole truth. But looking at Emily there in the hospital bed, pregnant and fragile, she decided it wasn't the time. "I'm afraid," she finally said. "Afraid of what?" "Of being alone. David has always been everything to me. When his father abandoned us, it was just him and me against the world. And now, with you and the baby—" "You think you're going to lose David?" "I don't think, I'm sure. And maybe it really is time for that to happen." Emily was surprised by her mother-in-law's honesty. It was the first time the two had really talked since they met. "Mrs. Margaret, you're not going to lose David. A son doesn't stop loving his mother because he has his own family. Maybe he doesn't stop loving, but he stops needing. And is that bad?" Mrs. Margaret reflected on the question. "All these years I defined myself as David's mother. That's who I was. And if he doesn't need me anymore, who am I going to be? You're going to be our baby's grandmother, and you can be a mother-in-law we love and respect, instead of someone we fear." Emily's words touched Mrs. Margaret's heart deeply. Here was a young woman, pregnant, being threatened with eviction and yet trying to comfort her. "Emily, What is it?" "I'm sorry. For everything." "It's okay, Mrs. Margaret. I understand that changes are hard." Mrs. Margaret wanted to say more. She wanted to tell her about the past, about the guilt she had carried for so many years. But at that moment, she decided the most important thing was to fix the present. "When we leave the hospital, things are going to be different," she promised. "How so?" "You don't need to worry about looking for a house anymore. I won't evict you." Emily felt immense relief. She began to cry, but they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret. You can't imagine the weight you've lifted off my shoulders." Yes, I can imagine, and Mrs. Margaret really could imagine, because she had seen that desperation before in the eyes of the same person 30 years ago. The next morning, when the doctors discharged Emily, the family returned home with a completely different atmosphere. David noticed the change in his mother, but didn't understand what had caused this transformation. In the following days, Mrs. Margaret made an effort to be kind to her daughter-in-law. She prepared tea for her, asked about the baby, avoided any comment that could cause stress. Emily, in turn, became more relaxed. The contractions stopped, and she was able to sleep better. The atmosphere at home improved significantly, but David still carried the weight of the secret he had discovered. "I knew sooner or later the truth would come out. And when it did, I had no idea how Emily would react." 1 week after the hospital visit, in the 38th week of pregnancy, Emily went into real labor. It was 4 in the morning when she woke David. "I think the time has come," she said, holding her belly. "Are you sure?" "The contractions are regular and getting stronger." David woke his mother and the three of them went to the hospital. On the way, Mrs. Margaret held Emily's hand, trying to calm her. "Everything will be fine, my dear," she said, using a tender tone for the first time. "I'm scared, Mrs. Margaret. It's normal to be scared, but you are strong. You can do this." David watched the scene in the rearview mirror, moved to see the two women finally growing closer. At the hospital, the delivery lasted 8 hours. David stayed by his wife's side the whole time, while Mrs. Margaret waited in the waiting room, anxious for news. When they finally heard the baby's cry, Mrs. Margaret felt an emotion she hadn't experienced in a long time. Her grandson had been born. A few minutes later, David came out of the delivery room with teary eyes. "It's a boy, Mom, a healthy boy." Mrs. Margaret hugged her son, crying with joy. "What will you name him?" "Benjamin." Benjamin Carter Mitchell. The name made Mrs. Margaret shudder. Carter was Emily's maiden name. The baby would carry part of his mother's history, including the years in the orphanage that she had helped make more difficult. When visits were allowed, Mrs. Margaret entered the room where Emily was breastfeeding the newborn. The scene transported her back in time, reminding her of when she herself had breastfed David, alone in the hospital, without the child's father to support her. "He is beautiful, Emily," she said, approaching the bed. "Would you like to hold him?" Mrs. Margaret hesitated. She didn't feel deserving of that honor, knowing what she knew about her past with Emily. "I don't know if—" "Please, Mrs. Margaret, he's your grandson." With trembling hands, Mrs. Margaret took the baby into her arms. Benjamin opened his little dark eyes, just like his mother's, and stared at his grandmother. In that moment, all the weight of the guilt she had carried for 30 years seemed to intensify. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Thank you for changing your mind about kicking us out of the house," said Emily. "I can't imagine what it would be like to take care of him alone in a small apartment." Emily's words were like daggers in Mrs. Margaret's heart. Her daughter-in-law was being grateful for something that should be natural, having the support of family. "Emily, I need to tell you something," she said, handing the baby back to his mother. "What is it?" David, who had stepped out to call some relatives, returned at that moment and sensed the tension in the air. "Mum, what are you doing?" "It's time for her to know the truth, David." "What truth?" Emily asked, looking from one to the other. "Not here, Mom. Not now," David pleaded. "If not now, it never will be." Mrs. Margaret sat in the chair next to the hospital bed and took a deep breath. "Emily, do you remember that family that tried to adopt you when you were 6? "I vaguely remember. Why are you asking that?" "The woman was me." Emily stopped rocking the baby and stared fixedly at her mother-in-law. "What do you mean?" "I was the woman who took you home for a few months in 1992, and then I returned you to the orphanage." The room fell into absolute silence. Emily processed the information, trying to connect the fragmented memories of her childhood with the present reality. You are the woman who said I was too problematic?" "Yes." "The woman who promised me a family and then changed her mind?" "Yes." Emily began to cry, but they were not tears of sadness. It was anger, frustration, disbelief. "You knew who I was from the first day David brought me home?" "I did." "And you never said anything?" "I didn't know how to say it." "And all this hostility, all this cruelty over the past few months, was because of this?" "Mrs." Margaret nodded, unable to look her daughter-in-law in the eyes. "It was guilt, shame, fear that you would find out." David approached the bed and held his wife's hand. "Emily, I found out a few weeks ago. I didn't know how to tell you." "You both knew and let me suffer, thinking I had done something wrong? It wasn't meant to hurt you, love." "It wasn't meant to hurt me!" Emily shouted for the first time, making the baby cry. "You let me go through all this anguish, pregnant, stressed, almost losing our son, because you didn't know how to tell the truth." The argument caught the nurse's attention, who asked them to keep their voices down for the other patients. "Emily, please, let's talk at home," begged David. "At home? What home, David? The home of the woman who abandoned me twice in my life." "Emily." First time when I was 6 years old and needed a family. Second time now when I'm pregnant and needed support." Mrs. Margaret was crying silently in the chair. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I'm sorry for everything." "You're sorry? Do you know what it's like to grow up in an orphanage? Do you know what it's like to see other children being adopted while you're left behind? Do you know the frustration of having a family for a few months and then being returned like a defective object? I was very young. I didn't know how to handle it. And now you're 62 and still don't know how to handle your own mistakes." The baby's crying grew louder, and Emily had to focus on calming him. David took the moment to ask his mother to leave the room. "Mom, it's better if you go home. We'll talk later." "David, Please, Mom. Give her some time to process all this." Mrs. Margaret nodded and left the room, leaving the young couple alone with the baby. "Emily, I'm sorry for not telling you sooner," said David. "How could you hide this from me? I found out recently and didn't know what the right time to tell you was. You were pregnant, stressed. The right time would have been when you found out, David. I'm your wife. I have a right to know things that affect me directly." "You're right. I was wrong." Emily rocked the baby and stayed silent for a few minutes. "Now I understand everything. The hostility from day one, the mean comments, the attempt to kick me out of the house. It was guilt. She was trying to get rid of the memory of what she did. Maybe. But this past week she changed, you saw. She was trying to be different. Out of pity, David. Not out of love or acceptance. Out of pity for the girl she abandoned in childhood. And what do you want to do now?" Emily looked at her son in her arms and sighed. "I don't know, I need to think." That night Emily stayed at the hospital for observation, as was protocol after childbirth. David went back home to get some things and talk to his mother. He found Mrs. Margaret in the kitchen making soup. "How is she?" she asked. "Devastated. And with every right to be." "I ruined everything, didn't I, David?" "I don't know, Mom. Maybe it can still be fixed." "How?" "She will never forgive me." "And she shouldn't." David sat at the table and watched his mother cooking. She seemed to have aged 10 years in a few hours. "Mum, tell me properly what happened back then, everything." Mrs. Margaret turned off the stove and sat down across from her son. "I was 28, alone with you, working 2 jobs. The social worker from the orphanage was my co-worker at the factory. She told me about a little girl who needed a temporary family. And you accepted to give me a sister." "I accepted because I thought it would be good for you to have company, and also because I felt sorry for the girl. She had lost her parents in a car accident." "What was she like?" "Quiet during the day, but at night she cried a lot. Had terrible nightmares. She would scream, call for her parents. You tried to comfort her, climbed into her bed, stayed awake until she calmed down. I vaguely remember that. After a few weeks I was exhausted. I worked all day, came home and found you both awake. You were a child, David, but you acted like an adult taking care of Emily. And then you decided to give her back? I lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks trying to handle everything. But I couldn't anymore. I was losing my job. You were starting to have problems at school because you slept in class." Mrs. Margaret stopped to wipe her eyes. "And then?" "I called the social worker and said I couldn't take care of Emily, that she needed someone with more experience, more patience." "What was it like when you took her back to the orphanage?" "Terrible. She cried the whole way. Asked if she had done something wrong, if I didn't like her anymore. You cried too, begged for her to stay. And after that, you two never saw each other again. Until she showed up at my door as your girlfriend, 25 years later." David took in the whole story. He could understand both sides of the situation, but knew it didn't lessen the pain Emily was feeling. "And why did you decide to be hostile to her now, Mother? Why didn't you tell the truth from the start?" "Because I was ashamed, David. Ashamed of having given up on a child who needed me. And also because she became a wonderful woman, despite everything she went through. That made me feel even worse." "How so?" "If she had grown up troubled, rebellious, I could justify my decision. But looking at her, kind, polite, loving with you, I realized I might have given up too soon." "Do you still think you did the right thing back then?" Mrs. Margaret reflected on the question. I did what I thought was best under those circumstances, but looking back, perhaps I should have asked for help, sought support, tried a little longer. And now, what do you intend to do? I don't know if there's anything I can do, David. Maybe it really is better for you to find another place to live. Away from me. Mother. She will never be able to forgive me. And I can't blame her for that. David spent the rest of the night thinking about the situation. The next day, when he went to pick up Emily at the hospital, she was quiet and thoughtful. Have you decided what you want to do? He asked. Not yet. But I know I can't stay in that house knowing everything I know now. Where will we go? I don't know, David. Maybe we'll rent a small apartment for now. With what money? You know our budget is tight. We'll manage. We always have. When they got home, they found Mrs. Margaret in the garden tending to the plants. She had prepared the baby's room down to the smallest detail. New crib, mobiles, diapers, little clothes organized by size. Emily was surprised to see all that care, but at the same time felt a pang of sadness. It was as if her mother-in-law was trying to compensate with gifts what she hadn't given 30 years ago. Mrs. Margaret, you didn't need to do all this, she said. I wanted to do something for my grandson. Thank you. The atmosphere was tense. Emily took care of the baby. David tried to mediate the situation, and Mrs. Margaret kept a respectful distance. But everyone felt the weight of the unspoken in the air. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. 3 days after returning from the hospital, Emily made a decision. David, I want us to move. I can't stay here anymore. Emily, let's think this through. We have a newborn baby, no savings. I'd rather struggle financially than live with this emotional burden every day. What if we gave my mother a chance? She's trying to change, out of guilt, David, not out of love. I don't want to raise our son in an environment where the grandmother is being nice out of obligation. That afternoon, while Emily was breastfeeding Benjamin in the bedroom, Mrs. Margaret knocked on the door. May I come in? Yes, you may. Mrs. Margaret sat in a chair near the bed. Emily, may I ask you a question? Of course. Do you remember anything good from those months you spent at my house? Emily reflected for a moment. I remember David playing with me. He was kind. He always tried to comfort me when I cried. Anything else? Why are you asking this? Just curiosity. Emily kept thinking. I remember a woman who sometimes braided my hair before I went to sleep. And stories. Someone told me stories about princesses. Mrs. Margaret smiled sadly. It was me who braided your hair and told the stories. It was you. Every day, before you went to sleep, you always asked for the story of Snow White. Emily was surprised. She didn't remember it was her mother-in-law who did that. Why did you stop? Because it was getting harder to say goodbye to you every night. I was starting to get attached, and I knew I couldn't. What do you mean? Emily, I didn't return you to the orphanage because I didn't like you. I returned you because I liked you too much and knew I wasn't in a position to raise you properly. I don't understand. I was falling apart, emotionally and financially. I worked 16 hours a day just to pay the basic bills. You and David deserved more than I could offer at that time. But at least you tried. Other families didn't even do that. And that doesn't lessen the pain I caused you. Emily rocked the baby gently, processing the information. Mrs. Margaret, may I ask a question now? Of course. Why did you decide to tell the truth now? Because looking at Benjamin, seeing you caring for him with so much love, I realized how hard it must have been for a 6-year-old child to understand why the family she thought was hers suddenly didn't want her anymore. Emily began to cry silently. It was very hard indeed. I blamed myself for years, thinking I had done something wrong. And I blamed myself for years too, thinking that maybe I should have tried harder. And now? What do we do with all this guilt? Mrs. Margaret didn't know how to answer. They stayed silent for a few minutes, just listening to the baby's soft noises. "May I tell you one more thing?" said Mrs. Margaret. "What? All these years I've followed your life from afar." "What do you mean?" "I kept in touch with the social worker from the orphanage. She would tell me how you were doing in school." "You knew about my life?" "I knew you were one of the best students at the orphanage. I knew you won a scholarship to university. I knew you graduated in business administration with honors." Emily was shocked. "And why did you follow my life?" "Because I never stopped caring about you, Emily. Even after I returned you to the orphanage, you remained important to me." "Important? Then why were you so cruel to me all these months?" "Because seeing you grow up and become a wonderful woman made me feel even worse about my decision. It was easier to try to push you away than to deal with the guilt." Emily looked at her mother-in-law with new eyes. For the first time she could see beyond the hostility and see the pain that Mrs. Margaret also carried. "Mrs. Margaret, can you show me the photos you kept from that time?" "Do you really want to see them?" "I do. Maybe it will help me understand that period better." An hour later, the two were in the living room flipping through the old photo album. David observed the scene from afar, hopeful they could find a way to overcome the past. "This one is from the day you came home," Mrs. Margaret showed. "You had a little doll in your hand." "What did it look like?" "Small, with blonde hair, a blue dress. You wouldn't let go of it." "What happened to the doll?" "When I took you back to the orphanage, you forgot it in the car. I've kept it until today." Mrs. Margaret got up and went to fetch the doll from a box in her room. When she returned, Emily was moved to see the toy. "Wow, it's true. I remember it now. Do you want to keep it? You can give it to Benjamin when he's a little older." Emily took the doll in her hands and felt a strong emotional connection to that time in her life. "Thank you for keeping it. Don't mention it. It was yours, it always was." They continued looking at the photos. There were several pictures of Emily and David playing together in the backyard, having lunch at the table, watching television. "You two looked like real siblings," commented Mrs. Margaret. "I remember feeling safe when I was near him," said Emily, looking at her husband. "And I remember not wanting you to leave," said David. "I cried so much the day Mom took you back to the orphanage." "You both cried," added Mrs. Margaret. "It was one of the hardest days of my life." "If it was so hard, why did you do it?" asked Emily. "Because at the time I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. For you, who deserved a stable family. For David, who was suffering with the situation at home. And for me, who couldn't handle everything. And do you think it was the right decision?" Mrs. Margaret reflected for a long time before answering. "I don't know anymore, Emily. For years I thought so. But seeing you here as my son's wife, my grandson's mother, I wonder how our lives would have been different if I had found the strength to continue." "Maybe you did the best you could at the time," said Emily, surprising herself with her own generosity. "You think so?" "Mrs. Margaret, you were 28, alone, working too much. I understand it was an impossible situation. But that doesn't justify the suffering I caused you." "It doesn't justify it, but it explains it. And maybe that understanding is what we need to move forward." David approached the two women. "Does this mean you can try to build a new relationship based on truth?" Emily looked at her mother-in-law and then at her husband. "I don't know. It's a lot to process. But maybe it's worth trying." "And you, Mum?" asked David. "I would like to try, yes, if Emily gives me that opportunity." "It won't be easy," Emily cautioned. "It will take time for me to trust again." "I understand, and I will respect your time." At that moment, Benjamin started crying in the room. Emily got up to attend to him, but Mrs. Margaret offered, "May I go see what he wants?" Emily hesitated for a second, but then nodded. Mrs. Margaret went to the room and picked up her grandson. The baby calmed down immediately in her arms. "See? He recognizes you as his grandmother," said David, who had followed his mother. "Or perhaps he just senses I'm no longer a threat to his family," replied Mrs. Margaret wisely. In the following days, the atmosphere at home changed completely. Mrs. Margaret made an effort to show through actions that she was willing to change. She prepared special meals for Emily, helped with the baby when needed, but always respecting the new mother's space. Emily, in turn, tried to overcome the resentment and give her mother-in-law a chance. It wasn't easy, but she noticed Mrs. Margaret was genuinely trying to make up for past mistakes. 1 week after the truth was revealed, Emily had an idea. "Mrs. Margaret, can you teach me how to make that sweet you used to make for David when he was a child?" "The condensed milk pudding? That's the one. I want to learn so I can make it for Benjamin when he grows up." "Of course, dear. We can make it now if you'd like." The two spent the afternoon in the kitchen preparing the sweet. As they stirred the ingredients, they talked about recipes, about family traditions, about the baby's future. "You know, Emily, I always dreamed of teaching my recipes to a daughter-in-law," said Mrs. Margaret. "And I always dreamed of having a mother-in-law who would teach me things like this. Even after everything that happened. Mrs. Margaret, the past doesn't change, but the future can still be built." Those words touched the older woman's heart deeply. For the first time in months, she felt hope that she could have a real family again. While the pudding baked in the oven, they sat in the living room to breastfeed Benjamin. Mrs. Margaret watched the scene fondly. "Can I give you some breastfeeding advice?" she asked. "Of course. When David was a baby, I found that if I gently massaged his back during feeding, he would relax more." Emily tried the tip and really noticed the baby became calmer. "It worked. Where did you learn that?" "From a nurse at the hospital where David was born. She taught me several techniques." "Can you teach me other things?" "Yes, I can, if you want." For the first time since they had met, Emily smiled genuinely at her mother-in-law. "Yes, I want to." That evening, during dinner, David noticed the change in the relationship between the two women. "How was your afternoon?" he asked. "Good," replied Emily. "Your mother taught me how to make pudding and some techniques for caring for Benjamin. And Emily is an excellent student," added Mrs. Margaret, "much more skilled in the kitchen than I imagined." "I always thought I didn't know how to cook properly," laughed Emily. "Nonsense. You just needed someone to guide you." David was moved to see the two talking in a friendly way. It was everything he had always wished for. 2 weeks later, Emily made an important decision. "David, I don't want to look for another place to live anymore." "Really? Your mother is making a sincere effort to change, and I realize she really cares about us." "Are you sure?" "I am, but I want to make some changes to our family dynamic." "What kind of changes?" "I want us to establish clear and healthy boundaries, and I want your mother to be involved in decisions about Benjamin, but respecting that we are the parents. I think that's fair. And I also want us to have regular conversations about how the living situation is going, to prevent problems from piling up like before." That night, the three sat at the table to establish the new rules for living together. It was a frank conversation, where each could express their needs and expectations. "Mrs. Margaret, I need you to understand that some decisions about Benjamin are ours alone," said Emily. "I understand perfectly. You are the parents. But we also want you to be part of his life, as a grandmother, not as a visitor. That is very important to me, Emily. Thank you. And I need everyone to understand that I'm still processing everything I discovered about our past," Emily continued. "Sometimes I may be more sensitive or distant, and I need you to be patient with me." "Of course," said David. "It's natural that you need time." "And I will do everything in my power to show that I am a different person from who I was 30 years ago," promised Mrs. Margaret. "You don't need to prove anything, Mrs. Margaret. You just need to be sincere and respectful. That's what I will be." In the following months, the relationship between the 3 generations of the family grew stronger. Mrs. Margaret proved to be a dedicated and respectful grandmother. She helped with the baby when asked, but never interfered with the parents' decisions. Emily, in turn, gradually opened up to her mother-in-law. She began telling stories about her youth, about the years in the orphanage, about how she built her independence. Mrs. Margaret listened to everything with attention and affection, without trying to minimize the difficulties Emily had faced. David watched the transformation of the 2 women with joy. His mother had become more mature and reflective, while his wife demonstrated a capacity for forgiveness that impressed him. One day, when Benjamin was 3 months old, Emily had an idea. "Mrs. Margaret, Would you like to accompany me on a visit to the orphanage where I grew up? Are you sure? I am. I think it would be important for both of us. Why? Because I want you to see where I grew up, to better understand my story. And I also want to say goodbye to some ghosts from the past. The following Saturday, the two women went to the orphanage. The place had changed a lot over the years, but still maintained the same basic structure. The current director received them warmly and made a point of showing them the facilities. Emily told her story and explained that she had grown up there. "We have some old records," said the director. "If you like, I can show you the archive from that time." Emily accepted the offer. Seeing her records, she could better reconstruct her trajectory in the orphanage. "Look here," the director showed. "There's an interesting note. It says you were temporarily adopted in 1992, but returned after 6 weeks. "It was I who had adopted her," said Mrs. Margaret, her voice choked. "And there's another interesting thing," continued the director. "For several years, someone made anonymous donations specifically to fund your studies, Emily." "Anonymous donations?" "Yes. Books, school supplies, even part of your university tuition was paid by an unknown donor." Emily looked at Mrs. Margaret, who had turned red. "It was you?" "It was," admitted Mrs. Margaret. "All those years, it was the only way I found to still take care of you, even from afar." Emily was moved, discovering that her former adoptive family had never stopped worrying about her, completely changed her perspective on everything. "Why did you never tell me this?" "Because I didn't deserve your acknowledgement. I had abandoned you. Paying for your studies was the least I could do." "Mrs. Margaret, you paid for my college?" "Not all of it, just a part. You also earned a merit scholarship." Emily began to cry. They were not tears of sadness, but of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," was all she could say. "Don't mention it, my dear. It was my obligation." On the way home, the two talked as they had never talked before. Emily shared details about her college years, about the financial difficulties she faced, about how important the help with her studies had been. "You know, Mrs. Margaret, now I understand why I always had luck with scholarships and academic opportunities. I thought it was just my own merit." "It was your merit, yes. The donations just ensured you had the conditions to show your talent." "Even so, thank you, for not having completely forgotten me." "I never forgot you, Emily. Not for a single day." When they arrived home, they found David taking care of Benjamin in the garden. "How was the visit?" he asked. "Enlightening," replied Emily. "Your mother has many secrets kept." "Good secrets, I hope." "Very good ones." That night, Emily had a long conversation with her husband about everything she had discovered. "David, now I understand why your mother felt so guilty. She never stopped caring for me, even from a distance." "And does that change anything for you?" "It changes everything. It makes me see that she really cared, that the decision to return me to the orphanage was hard for her too." "And now? How do you feel about her?" "I'm still processing everything. But I feel like we're building something new, based on truth and mutual affection." "I'm happy to hear that. And you, David? How are you feeling about this whole situation?" "Relieved. I always dreamed of a united family, and now I feel that's possible." In the following months, the relationship between Emily and Mrs. Margaret continued to evolve. The older woman made an effort to be present in her grandson's life without being intrusive. She helped with Benjamin's care when asked, but respected the parents' decisions. Emily, in turn, began to include her mother-in-law in her routines. She invited her for walks with the baby, asked for advice about motherhood, shared small daily victories. When Benjamin turned 6 months old, Emily made a decision that surprised the family. "Mrs. Margaret, I would like you to be Benjamin's godmother at the baptism." "Me? Are you sure?" "I am. You took care of me when I was a child, even if for a short time, and now you're taking care of my son. You are the right person to be his godmother." Mrs. Margaret was moved to tears. "It would be an honor, Emily. But there's one condition." "What is it?" "I want you to stop calling me Emily all the time and start calling me daughter, because that's what I am to you now." "My daughter," said Mrs. Margaret, hugging Emily. "My dear daughter." The baptism was an intimate celebration, but full of meaning. Father Michael, who had known the family for years, was moved to learn the story behind that ceremony. It's rare to see a family that can turn pain into love, resentment into forgiveness, he commented during the ceremony. After the baptism, the family gathered at home for a special lunch. Mrs. Margaret had prepared all her daughter-in-law's favorite dishes, and Emily had made desserts to please her mother-in-law. "I'd like to make a toast," said David, raising his glass, "to our family, which managed to overcome the past and build a future based on love and truth. To Benjamin," added Emily, "who definitively united us and taught us that love can heal any wound. And to second chances," said Mrs. Margaret, "which allow us to fix mistakes and build stronger, truer relationships." The 3 generations toasted, celebrating not only the baby's baptism, but the renewal of family bonds that had been tested and strengthened by adversity. That afternoon, as Benjamin slept in his grandmother's arms, Emily watched the scene and felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had finally found not only a family, but also the answers to the questions she had carried since childhood. "What are you thinking about?" asked David. "I'm thinking that sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, even if it's not in the way we expected." "How so?" "I always dreamed of finding the family that adopted me when I was a child. I wanted to understand why it didn't work out, if I had done something wrong." "And now you have those answers?" "Not just the answers. I have the family itself back. In a completely different way, but back." Mrs. Margaret, listening to the conversation, smiled through her tears. "And I have my daughter back too. The girl I took care of for a few months became the mother of my grandson and the daughter-in-law I always dreamed of having." "We are a peculiar family," laughed Emily, "but we are a real family." Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. 2 years had passed since Benjamin's birth. The child grew up in an environment of family harmony that none of the adults had imagined possible at the beginning of Emily's pregnancy. Mrs. Margaret established herself as a present but respectful grandmother. She took care of her grandson for a few hours each day, while Emily worked part-time at the accounting firm that had finally hired her. The company, run by Mrs. Patricia, a 60-year-old woman, was impressed with Emily's dedication and competence. "You are exactly the type of employee I'm looking for," said Mrs. Patricia after a few months. "Responsible, attentive to detail, and with life experience that shows in your work." Emily felt professionally fulfilled for the first time since her pregnancy. The part-time work allowed her to contribute financially to the family without giving up closely following her son's growth. At home, the family dynamic had settled naturally. Mrs. Margaret took care of the meals and house maintenance. David worked as an engineer at a construction company, and Emily divided her time between the office and caring for Benjamin. The 3 generations had learned to live together, respecting individual spaces while maintaining family unity. They had dinner together every night, shared household responsibilities, and made important decisions jointly. Benjamin, who was already walking and uttering his first words, was the center of everyone's affectionate attention. He called David Daddy, Emily Mommy, and Mrs. Margaret Grandma. For him, there was nothing unusual about the family structure. It was simply the world he knew and where he felt loved. One Saturday morning, while Emily was preparing breakfast and David was playing with Benjamin in the living room, Mrs. Margaret received a phone call that changed the course of that tranquil day. "Hello?" she answered. "Mrs. Margaret Mitchell?" "Yes, speaking." "This is Memorial General Hospital. Are you a relative of Richard Mitchell?" Mrs. Margaret turned pale. Richard was her ex-husband, David's father, who had abandoned the family when the boy was 8. "I'm his ex-wife. Why are you calling?" "He was admitted last night in serious condition. He had a heart attack and is in the ICU. He's asking to speak with his son." "After more than 25 years?" "Ma'am, I understand the situation is complicated, but he is quite debilitated. He said he has important things to settle before it's too late." Mrs. Margaret hung up the phone with trembling hands. Emily noticed something had happened. What is it, Mrs. Margaret? Who called? It was from the hospital. Rodrigo's father has been admitted. David stopped playing with Benjamin and looked at his mother. My father? What father? Richard. Your father, David. The young man fell silent for a few seconds, processing the information. And why are they calling here? He abandoned us over 20 years ago. He wants to talk to you. He's in the ICU with little time left. Emily approached her husband and took his hand. What do you want to do? I don't know. I really don't. David, he is your father, said Mrs. Margaret. Regardless of what happened in the past, he is your father. Father? What father, Mum? The man who abandoned us when I needed him most. The man who never sent a birthday card, never asked how I was. I understand your anger, son, but perhaps he has important things to say. And what could he possibly have to say after so many years? Emily intervened gently. David, you might regret it later if you don't go, even if it's just to be sure you don't want to hear him. Do you think I should go? I think you should do what your heart tells you, but remember that some opportunities don't come back. David spent the rest of the morning thinking. He walked around the house, looked at his son playing, observed the family he had built. The presence of the absent father felt like an intrusion into that harmony. In the afternoon, he made his decision. I'll go see him, but I want you all to come with me. All of us? Asked Mrs. Margaret. Everyone. I want him to see the family I built without him. I want him to meet his grandson and my wife. Are you sure you want to take Benjamin to a hospital? I am. If my father wants to know who I've become, he needs to see my whole reality. In the late afternoon, the family headed to Memorial General Hospital. Benjamin slept in Emily's arms, David drove in silence, and Mrs. Margaret looked out the window, lost in thoughts of the past. At the hospital, they went to the ICU. The head nurse briefed them on the visitation rules. Only 2 people at a time, and the baby cannot enter the ICU, she explained. Then I'll stay here with Benjamin, said Emily. You 2 go first. David and Mrs. Margaret entered the ICU. The man in bed 7 was unrecognizable. Richard Mitchell, whom David remembered as a strong, imposing man, now looked frail and aged. When he saw his son approach, Richard opened his eyes with difficulty. David, he whispered. Hi, Dad. You came. I did. Richard tried to sit up in bed but had no strength. You're so grown. Such a man. David didn't know what to say. 25 years of anger and hurt didn't disappear easily. Why did you call me here? He asked. Because it's time to set things right just before I go. Set what right? You abandoned us, Dad. You abandoned me and Mom when we needed you most. I know. I know I did that. And why? Why did you leave? Richard closed his eyes, gathering strength to speak. Because I was a coward, David. A coward who didn't know how to be a father, how to be a husband. So the solution was to run away? There was no solution. I was lost, no job, no prospects. Job, no. I thought you'd be better off without me. Mrs. Margaret, who had remained silent until then, spoke up. Richard, you know that's not true. You left because you found another woman. Margaret, don't lie to David now. Not after all this time. Richard sighed deeply. It's true, David. I met someone else and thought it would be easier to start a new life than to fix the one that was broken. And did it work? Asked David, bitterness in his voice. No. It all went wrong. She left me 2 years later, and I've been alone ever since. And you never thought about coming back, about apologizing. I thought about it thousands of times, but time kept passing, and it became harder and harder to take the first step. The first step, Dad, was not leaving in the first place. I know, son. I know I ruined everything. David looked at that weakened man in the hospital bed and felt a mix of pity and anger. And now? What do you expect from me? Nothing, David. I expect nothing. I just wanted to see you one last time and say I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Sorry doesn't bring back the years we lost. It doesn't. But maybe it brings me a little peace before I go. David was silent for a few minutes, watching his father. Despite all the anger, he couldn't help but feel compassion for that lonely, remorseful man. "Dad, I have a family now." "I know. The nurse said you came with your wife and son. Would you like to meet them?" Richard was surprised by the offer. You would let me?" "I would, if you want." "Yes, I do. Very much." David left the ICU and called for Emily. Since the baby couldn't enter, she asked Mrs. Margaret to stay with Benjamin in the waiting room. When Emily entered the ICU, Richard was impressed. "She's beautiful, David." "Thank you, Dad." "Emily, this is my father, Richard." Emily approached the bed with a gentle smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Richard." "The pleasure is mine, my dear. David was lucky to find you." "Actually, we were lucky to find each other. Tell me about yourselves. How did you meet?" David briefly told the story of their courtship, marriage, and pregnancy. He talked about work, the house they lived in, their plans for the future. "And your son? What's his name?" "Benjamin. Benjamin Carter Mitchell." Could you tell me about him?" David pulled out his phone and showed several pictures of the boy. "He's 2 years old, starting to speak in full sentences. Loves playing with toy cars." Richard looked at the photos with teary eyes. "He looks like you when you were little. Everyone says that. David, you've become a good man, a present father, a dedicated husband, everything I couldn't be. Dad, I learned how to be a father by doing the exact opposite of what you did." The words were harsh, but Richard received them without taking offense. "And you learned well, very well." Emily realized this was a conversation father and son needed to have alone. "I'll let you two talk," she said. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Richard." "Thank you, my dear. Thank you for taking good care of my boy. He's the one who takes good care of me." After Emily left, David sat back down beside the bed. "Dad, can I ask you a question?" "Of course. Do you really regret leaving?" "I regret it every day, David. Every single blessed day." "If you could go back in time, would you do things differently?" "I'd do everything differently. I'd fight for our family. I'd seek help. I'd face the problems instead of running from them." "And why didn't you come back later? Even years later?" Richard sighed. Pride, shame, fear of not being accepted. The more time passed, the harder it got. "Mom suffered a lot after you left." "I can imagine. Margaret was always a strong woman, but I know it wasn't easy raising you alone." "It really wasn't. She worked 2 jobs for years to give me an education. And she succeeded. Look at the man you've become." David was silent for a moment. "Dad, I want you to know that I forgive you." Richard opened his eyes, surprised. "Forgive me?" "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to have peace in my heart." "David." "I haven't forgotten what you did. I haven't forgotten the hard years, Mom's tears, my own childhood confusion. But I choose not to carry this anger anymore." Richard began to cry silently. "Thank you, son, thank you. And I want you to know that, despite everything, you are Benjamin's grandfather. If you want to be part of his life, in a respectful and gradual way, I can consider that possibility." "Really? You would do that?" "I would. But there are conditions." "What are they?" "First, you cannot disappear from his life like you disappeared from mine. If you take on the role of grandfather, it has to be forever." "I understand." "Second, any relationship with Benjamin goes through the approval of me and Emily. We are his parents." "Of course." "Third, you need to first recover and show that you are truly willing to be a different person." "I'll try, David, I swear I'll try. And there's one more thing." "What?" "You need to make peace with Mum. You don't need to go back to her, but you need to at least properly apologize for what you did." "Will she want to talk to me?" "We'll find out." David called his mother to come into the ICU. Mrs. Margaret approached the bed with some hesitation. "Margaret," said Richard. "Richard, thank you for raising our son so well. He became a wonderful man. You don't need to thank me. It was my duty as a mother. But you did alone what was the responsibility of 2. I did it because I had no choice." Margaret, I want to apologize for everything. For abandoning you, for being a coward, for letting you carry the family's burden alone. Richard, let me finish. I know an apology doesn't fix the past, but I want you to know that I recognize my mistakes and that you were a much better wife and mother than I deserved. Mrs. Margaret was moved, but didn't respond immediately. And another thing, Richard continued, I want you to know that I never cheated on you during our marriage. The other woman came into the picture after I left home. That doesn't change much, Richard. It doesn't, but I thought it was important for you to know. Mrs. Margaret took a deep breath before speaking. Richard, I forgive you too. Not because you deserve it, but because holding a grudge is bad for the soul. Thank you, Margaret. But I want to make it clear that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean we're going to be friends. I understand. If you've really changed, if you really want to be part of our grandson's life, you'll have to prove it with actions, not words. I will prove it. If God gives me this chance, I will prove it. The family left the hospital with mixed feelings. David felt relieved for confronting the past, but at the same time apprehensive about what might come from that conversation. Do you think you did the right thing? Asked Emily on the way back home. I don't know, but I know I did what my heart told me to. And you, Mrs. Margaret, how do you feel? Strange. For years I carried anger towards Richard. Now that I've forgiven him, I feel lighter, but also confused. It's normal to feel that way, said Emily. Forgiveness is a process, not a single event. How do you know so much about this? I learned by forgiving you, replied Emily with a tender smile. Mrs. Margaret smiled back, touched by her daughter-in-law's sincerity. In the following days, they received news from the hospital about Richard's slow but steady recovery. The doctors said he had a chance of a full recovery, but would need care and physical therapy. A week after the visit, David received a phone call from his father. David, can I ask a favor? Of course, Dad. Could you visit me again? And maybe bring my grandson? David talked to Emily about the request. What do you think? I think we can try, but slowly, no pressure. The following Sunday, David, Emily and Benjamin went to the hospital. This time they got special permission for the boy to enter the ICU for a few minutes. When Richard saw his grandson for the first time, his eyes filled with tears. My God, he's beautiful. Benjamin, who was used to being the center of attention, wasn't fazed by the presence of the unknown grandfather. Hi, said the boy in his little child's voice. Hi, my little one. I'm your Grandpa Richard. Grandpa? Yes, Grandpa Richard. Benjamin approached the bed and offered one of his toys to his grandfather. For you. Richard took the toy car with trembling hands. Thank you, my little one. It's a very nice car. It's blue, said Benjamin, showing his favorite color. Blue like your eyes. The interaction between grandfather and grandson was natural and affectionate. Richard told Benjamin a simple story, who listened attentively. Emily watched the scene, analyzing whether the man posed any emotional risk to her son. After 15 minutes, they left the ICU. In the hallway, Richard called David. Son, can I ask one more thing? Of course. When I leave the hospital, do you think you could visit me a few times, at home, I mean? Dad, where do you live? In a small apartment alone, but I can have you over. Let's see how your recovery goes first. Of course, no pressure. A month later, Richard was discharged from the hospital. He was weak, but stable. David decided to help him with some basic needs, like grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. Gradually, the grandfather became a constant presence in Benjamin's life. He didn't live with the family, but visited regularly. He brought small gifts for his grandson, told him stories, played with him in the garden. Emily watched everything carefully, but noticed that Richard was really trying to be a different person. He respected the rules set by the parents, didn't interfere in the boy's upbringing, and showed genuine gratitude for being accepted back into the family. Mrs. Margaret maintained a cordial but distant relationship with her ex-husband. They weren't friends, but they managed to coexist civilly for the sake of the family. 6 months after the reconciliation, Benjamin was already calling Richard Grandpa Rick and would run to hug him whenever he saw him arrive. One day, Emily had a frank conversation with David about the situation. How do you feel having your father back in your life? Confused most of the time, but also grateful for the second chance. Have you managed to forgive him completely? I'm still in the process. Some days are easier than others. But I see how much Benjamin likes him, and that helps me. And aren't you afraid he'll disappear again? I am, but I've decided I won't live in fear. If he disappears again, we'll deal with it when it happens. And if Benjamin asks about the past when he grows up? We'll tell him the truth in an age-appropriate way, that Grandpa Rick made mistakes in the past, but is now trying to be a better person. Do you think he's really changed? I think he's trying to change, and that's already more than he did in the last 25 years. Richard's presence brought a new dynamic to the family. Benjamin now had two grandparents who loved him, each in their own way. Mrs. Margaret was the caring, ever-present grandmother, while Richard was the adventurous grandfather who made up games and told fantastic stories. For Benjamin's 3rd birthday, they threw a party at the family home. The entire extended family was present: David, Emily, Benjamin, Mrs. Margaret, Richard, and some neighbors who had become close friends. During the party, Richard asked to speak to the whole family. "I want to thank all of you for giving me a second chance," he said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I promise I will honor this opportunity." "Grandpa Rick!" shouted Benjamin, running to hug his grandfather. "Hi, my little one. Grandpa has a very special gift for you." Richard handed his grandson a handmade wooden box. "I made it for you myself, to keep your favorite toys in." Benjamin opened the box and was delighted with the details. "Do you like it?" asked Richard. "I love it. Thank you, Grandpa." Emily was impressed with the care and craftsmanship of the gift. "You really made this?" "I did. I'm taking a woodworking class to keep busy, and I thought it would be nice to make something special for my grandson." "It's beautiful, Dad," said David, genuinely moved. The party continued late into the night. When everyone had left, the family sat in the living room to talk about the day. "You know what moves me the most about all this?" said Emily. "What?" asked David. "Seeing how Benjamin is growing up surrounded by so much love. Love from the family he was born knowing, and love from the family he found again." "He really is lucky," agreed David. "We are all lucky," added Mrs. Margaret. "Who would have thought our family would grow and become so strong after everything we've been through?" "It's true," said David. "Sometimes I think everything happened exactly as it was supposed to." "How so?" "Think about it. If my father hadn't left, maybe you wouldn't have adopted Emily when she was a child. If you hadn't adopted Emily, she might have taken a completely different path in life. If she had taken a different path, I would never have met her." Emily reflected on her husband's words. "That's an interesting way of looking at things, as if it were all part of a bigger plan." "Maybe it is," said Mrs. Margaret, "or maybe it's just life teaching us that we can create good things even after mistakes and pain." "Either way," said Emily, "I'm grateful for what we have now." "Me too," agreed David and Mrs. Margaret simultaneously. 2 more years passed. Benjamin was 5 years old and getting ready to start school. The family had found a perfect balance in their living situation. Mrs. Margaret continued to live with David and Emily, but now everyone saw it as a conscious and positive choice, not as an imposition or a dependency. Emily had been promoted at the accounting firm and now worked almost full-time. Mrs. Margaret took care of Benjamin during the hours his parents worked, a role she performed with joy and responsibility. Richard visited the family twice a week and took his grandson out on alternating weekends. He had settled into a healthy and respectful routine, never trying to occupy spaces that weren't his. One afternoon, Benjamin asked a question everyone knew would come sooner or later. "Mommy, why didn't Grandpa Rick live with us before?" Emily looked at David, who nodded, giving her permission to answer. "Because sometimes, my love, grown-ups make mistakes and need time to learn how to fix them." "What mistake did Grandpa make?" "He left when your daddy was a child and stayed away from the family for a long time." "Why?" "Because he was confused and thought it would be better that way, but later he realized he was wrong." "And now he won't leave anymore?" "No, my love. Now he's learned that family is important and he won't leave anymore." Benjamin seemed satisfied with the explanation and went back to playing, But that evening during dinner, he asked more questions. "Daddy, were you sad when Grandpa Rick left?" David took a deep breath before answering. "I was very sad, yes. And angry. I was angry too. And now? Now I'm not angry anymore, because Grandpa apologized and is being a very good grandpa to you." "And Grandma Margaret, was she sad too?" Mrs. Margaret answered, "I was sad, yes, my love, but I learned that being sad forever doesn't solve anything. It's better to try to be happy with what we have now." Benjamin absorbed the information and made his final comment. "I like both of my grandparents, and they like you very much too," said Emily, kissing her son's head. That night, after Benjamin fell asleep, the three adults talked about how to handle the child's inevitable questions about the family structure. "I think we're handling it well," said David, "being honest but in a way that's right for his age." "I agree," said Emily, "and I think it's important for him to understand that families can be complicated, but that love can always overcome difficulties." "He's growing up in a family full of love," added Mrs. Margaret. "That's what matters." A year later, Benjamin started school. He was a sociable, intelligent, and affectionate child. The teachers always praised his behavior and his ease in making friends. At a parent-teacher conference, the teacher commented to Emily, "Benjamin is a very special child. He shows emotional maturity above average for his age." "In what sense?" "He understands that people can make mistakes and change. The other day, a little friend was sad because his father had argued with him. Benjamin said, 'Don't be sad. Sometimes parents do wrong things, but then they apologize and everything is okay.'" Emily smiled, proud of her son. He grew up in a family that went through some difficulties, but came together through forgiveness and love. That shows Benjamin has an emotional wisdom that only children raised with a lot of love develop. On the way back from school, Emily reflected on the teacher's words. Benjamin was growing up in a family that had been through hard tests, but emerged stronger and more united. He was learning valuable lessons about forgiveness, second chances, and the complexity of human relationships. At home, she found Mrs. Margaret preparing the afternoon snack and David helping Benjamin with a school activity. "How was the conference?" asked David. "Great. The teacher only had praise for Benjamin." "What kind of praise?" "She said he is emotionally mature and shows a lot of love for people." "That's true," agreed Mrs. Margaret. "That boy has a big heart." "Just like the family that raised him," said Emily, hugging her mother-in-law affectionately. At that moment, Benjamin ran into the kitchen. "Mommy, Mommy, look what I made at school." It was a drawing of the family. It showed Emily, David, Mrs. Margaret, Benjamin, and in a corner of the page, Richard. "How beautiful, my love. Who are these people?" "It's our family. You, Daddy, me, Grandma Margaret, and Grandpa Quim." "And why is Grandpa Quim farther away from the others?" "Because he lives in another house, but he's still part of our family." Emily was moved by the child's perspective. For Benjamin, there was no complexity or drama in the past. There was just a big family full of love, where each person had their place and their importance. "It's a very beautiful family," she said. "It's the best family in the world," replied Benjamin, with the innocent conviction of children. That night, Emily stuck the drawing on the refrigerator door. Whenever she looked at it, she remembered how transformative her journey had been. From an abandoned child in the orphanage, she went through a pregnancy surrounded by family tensions, almost lost her marriage because of secrets from the past, but in the end found not only a family, but also peace with her own history. David, watching his wife contemplate the drawing, approached. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about how surprising life is. Who would have thought the woman who abandoned me when I was a child would become the grandmother my son loves so much? And who would have thought the father who abandoned me would become the grandfather my son admires? Sometimes I think all of this was a big test to see if we were capable of forgiving and rebuilding." "And did we pass the test?" "With flying colors," replied Emily, smiling. A few months later, the family faced a new challenge. Mrs. Patricia, the owner of the firm where Emily worked, decided to retire and offered the business to her. "You want to buy the firm?" asked David, surprised. "She's offering very good terms. easy financing, an already established client base. But do you have the experience to run your own business? I have 4 years of experience in that firm. I know all the clients, all the procedures. And financially, how will we manage? Mrs. Patricia agreed that we pay in monthly installments over 3 years. It's almost like rent, but in the end the firm will be ours. David got excited about the possibility. It would be a huge step in our lives. It would, but I want to decide this as a family. That night, they talked with Mrs. Margaret about the proposal. It's a unique opportunity, said her mother-in-law. Mrs. Patricia has always been a serious and honest woman. If she's offering you the business, it's because she trusts your competence. But do you think I can handle it? Of course you can, replied David and Mrs. Margaret in unison. What about Benjamin? I'll be away from home more. I'll take care of him, offered Mrs. Margaret. I've been doing it for years. I can do a little more. Mrs. Margaret, don't you think that's too much responsibility? Emily, taking care of my grandson isn't a responsibility. It's a pleasure. 3 months later, Emily officially became the owner of the accounting firm. She kept the original name, Santa Rita Accounting Firm, out of respect for Mrs. Patricia, and because the clients already knew the brand. The transition was smooth. Emily hired an assistant to help with administrative tasks and even managed to expand the client base. Benjamin adapted well to the new routine. He spent more time with his grandmother, who took the opportunity to teach him things she hadn't had time to teach before. Basic cooking, gardening, family stories. Richard continued visiting regularly and was proud of his daughter-in-law's successes. You've become a businesswoman, he said during one visit. I'm still learning, Mr. Richard, but you're doing very well. David is lucky to have such a capable wife. Actually, we're the lucky ones to have a family that supported us. That's true. Family is everything. 1 year after buying the firm, Emily was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was met with joy by the entire family. Benjamin was thrilled with the news that he would be a big brother. Will it be a boy or a girl? He asked. We don't know yet, my love. I want it to be a girl, so I can teach her things. What kind of things? How to play with cars, how to draw, how to eat by herself. David and Emily looked at each other, moved by their son's maturity. You're going to be a very good big brother, said David. The best big brother in the world, Emily agreed. Mrs. Margaret was radiant at the prospect of having another grandchild. 2 little grandchildren, she would say, stroking Emily's belly. What a blessing. And you don't think it will be too much work taking care of 2? Too much work? Emily, taking care of grandchildren is the best job a grandmother can have. Richard also showed his joy at the news. Another grandchild for this doting grandpa, he said to Benjamin. Grandpa, are you going to teach the baby things too? Of course I am. I'll teach the same things I teach you. What do you teach Benjamin? Asked Emily, curious. I teach him that family is the most important treasure a person can have, and that when we make mistakes, we can always apologize and try to be better. Those are very important lessons, Emily agreed. At 7 months pregnant, Emily found out it would be a girl. Benjamin was even more excited. I'm going to teach her to be strong like you, Mommy, he said. Like me? Yes. Grandma Margaret told me you went through a lot of hard things when you were little, but you got strong and became the best mum in the world. Emily was touched by her son's words. And you help me be a better mum every day. The girl was born on a sunny spring morning. She was given the name Margaret Emily Mitchell, Margaret in honor of her grandmother, and Emily as her middle name. Mrs. Margaret cried when she learned her granddaughter's name. Are you sure? She asked. Absolute certainty, replied Emily. You deserve this tribute. But why? Because you're the one who taught me the true meaning of family, not just when I was a child, but especially now, as an adult. Benjamin adapted perfectly to the role of big brother. He helped take care of his sister, sang to her when she cried, and always asked to hold her. She's so tiny, he would say. You were like that too when you were born, David explained. And did someone take care of me? We all did. We all. Mommy, Grandma Margaret, Daddy. Everyone took care of you with lots of love. And now it's my turn to take care of Margaret. That's right. Now it's your turn. Margaret's arrival brought even more unity to the family. Richard became an even more dedicated grandfather, visiting more often to get to know his new granddaughter. Mrs. Margaret lived for her 2 grandchildren, but never in an excessive or smothering way. Emily managed to balance motherhood of 2 children with running the firm. She hired another employee and organized her schedule to be present for the family's important moments. 1 year after Margaret's birth, the family organized a big Christmas party. All members of the extended family were present, along with some close friends. During dinner, David asked to make a toast. "I want to toast to our family, which taught me that it doesn't matter where we start in life, but where we choose to go." "To our family," repeated Emily, "which showed me that home isn't a place, but people who love us unconditionally." "To our family," said Mrs. Margaret, "which taught me that it's never too late to apologize and start over." "To our family," said Richard, "which gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it, and taught me the true value of forgiveness." Benjamin, who was already 7 years old and understood the solemnity of the moment, also wanted to participate. "To our family, which is the best family in the world." Everyone laughed and agreed with the boy's toast. Margaret, who was on her grandmother's lap, babbled some sounds as if she also wanted to join in. That night, after the children went to sleep, the 4 adults sat on the porch to talk about the year that was ending. "Do you realize how far we've come since that day when I threatened to kick you out of the house?" said Mrs. Margaret. "It feels like a decade, but it's only been a few years," replied Emily. "And they've been years of great growth for all of us," added David. "The most impressive thing," said Richard, "is how all our wounds turned into wisdom." "How so?" "I learned to be a better father by having been a terrible one. Margaret learned to be a loving mother-in-law by having been hostile at first. Emily learned the power of forgiveness by having been hurt, and David learned to lead a family by having grown up in a broken one." "That's a beautiful way to see our experiences," said Emily. "And the most important thing," Richard continued, "is that Benjamin and Margaret will grow up in a family that knows how to deal with difficulties, that values forgiveness, and that understands the importance of giving second chances." "They'll have the tools we didn't have when we were young," agreed Mrs. Margaret. "And they'll know that family isn't perfect, but it's where we find unconditional love," added David. Emily looked at the house where her family was sleeping, her 2 children, her mother-in-law who had become a second mother, her husband who always supported her, and now also her father-in-law who had returned to add to the family. "You know what amazes me most about this whole story?" she said. "What?" "It's that every person in this family had to overcome something from the past to get where we are, and we all managed." "And what did you have to overcome?" asked Richard. "The feeling of abandonment, the fear of not being loved, the difficulty of trusting people." "And did you overcome it?" "Completely. Today I feel like the most loved person in the world." "Because you are," said David, kissing his wife affectionately. 2 years passed. Benjamin was 9 and Margaret was 3. The family had found perfect harmony in their life together. Benjamin was a responsible and caring boy who looked after his little sister with dedication. Margaret was a happy and clever child who brought laughter and energy into the house every day. Emily had expanded the accounting firm and now had 5 employees. The business was thriving, allowing the family to have a comfortable life without excessive luxuries. David had been promoted at the construction company and now coordinated important projects in the region. Mrs. Margaret, at 70 years old, remained active and healthy. She took care of her grandchildren with energy and dedication, but had also developed her own hobbies, like gardening and cooking. Richard, at 65, had retired and dedicated more time to his family. He learned to play the guitar, and every afternoon he teaches music to his grandchildren. One Sunday afternoon, Benjamin asked a question that surprised everyone. "Mommy, why is our family different from other families?" "Different how, sweetheart? At school, my friends only have 2 grandparents, or sometimes they don't even have grandparents. I have 2 grandparents. You had 2 different families." Emily thought carefully about her answer. "Our family is special, Benjamin, because it was built with a lot of love and forgiveness. Sometimes families go through difficult times, But when people truly love each other, they can overcome anything. Like when Grandpa Rick was away for a long time. Exactly. He made a mistake, but later apologized and returned to the family. And when Grandma Margaret didn't like Mommy, Mrs. Margaret smiled at the innocence of the question. I always liked your Mommy, Benjamin. I was just confused and scared. But later, I learned that family is about accepting and loving people. Our family is like a puzzle, said Margaret, who had come running from playing. What do you mean, my little one? Each person is a different piece, but when you put it all together, it becomes a beautiful family. The adults were impressed by the 3-year-old girl's metaphor. That's exactly it, Margaret, said Emily. Our family is like a puzzle where every piece has its importance. That night, after the children fell asleep, Emily had an intimate conversation with David. Sometimes I wonder how our life would have been if your mother hadn't made that threat back when I was pregnant. Why? Because it was from that crisis that we discovered the truth about our past. If she hadn't been hostile, maybe we would never have known we knew each other since we were children. And do you think that would have made a difference? I think so. Our relationship became deeper after we understood our shared history. That's true. And my father's presence in the children's lives was also only possible because of that crisis. How so? If we hadn't gone through those difficulties, I wouldn't have matured enough to forgive my father when he reappeared. Emily reflected on her husband's words. So you think everything happened as it was supposed to happen? I think every difficulty we faced prepared us to be the people we are today. And are you happy with who you've become? Very happy. I'm a better husband, a better father, a better son, and you? Me too. I'm more confident, more generous, wiser. And our family? Our family is the greatest treasure we could have. On David and Emily's 10th wedding anniversary, they organized an intimate party to celebrate the date. Only the closest family members and some special friends were present. During the party, each family member gave a little speech for the couple. Benjamin, who was now 11, spoke first. Mommy and Daddy, thank you for teaching me that family is about love and forgiveness. You are the best parents in the world. Margaret, 5 years old, said in her childish way, I love you very, very, very much. Mrs. Margaret became emotional as she spoke. Emily and David, thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to be a better person. You turned a bad mother-in-law into a happy grandmother. Richard, visibly moved, gave his speech. My son and my daughter-in-law, thank you for giving me a second chance as a father and as a grandfather. You proved that love is stronger than any mistake from the past. Finally, Emily and David gave their speeches to each other. David, thank you for staying by my side through all the difficult moments, for being patient when I needed time to forgive, for supporting me in all the important decisions, and for building with me the family of my dreams. Emily, thank you for teaching me the true meaning of forgiveness and unconditional love, for opening your heart to my mother and my father, even after everything we went through, and for making me a better man every day. After the speeches, the whole family hugged in a photo that became one of the most precious records of that beautiful story of love, forgiveness, and family rebuilding. Years later, when Benjamin was in university and Margaret in high school, they would often tell their friends the story of their unconventional family. My grandmother used to be my mother-in-law, Benjamin would say, provoking laughter from his classmates. And my grandfather was a deserter who returned to the family, added Margaret. But don't you think that's weird? Their friends would ask. For us it's normal, the siblings would reply. We grew up in a family where everyone had to learn to forgive and be forgiven. That's what makes our family special. Emily and David, now in their 40s, looked back with gratitude for all the experiences they had lived, the difficulties of the early marriage, the pregnancy surrounded by tensions, the painful revelations about the past, the unexpected return of the absent father. All of it had contributed to forming a solid and loving family. Do you regret anything that happened in our story? Emily asked one Sunday afternoon. I only regret keeping secrets. As for the rest, everything contributed to making us who we are. Even the painful parts. Especially the painful parts. They taught us to value the peace we have now. And do you think our children will face their own difficulties wisely? I think so. They grew up seeing that problems can be solved with love and dialogue. That's more valuable than any material inheritance. On the eve of Benjamin's 20th birthday, he made a discovery that moved him deeply. He was helping Grandma Margaret organize the attic when he found a box with old photographs. Among the pictures, he found an image of himself with Emily when they were children, during the time she had been temporarily adopted by the family. "Grandma, can I keep this photo?" "Of course, my grandson. Why?" "Because I want to show it to Mom. It's beautiful to see you two when you were little." When he showed the photo to Emily, she was moved. "Look how small we were. Don't you remember anything from that time?" "I vaguely remember a girl who played with me, but I never imagined it was you. And I remember a kind boy who comforted me when I cried." "Fate is an amazing thing," said Benjamin. "You met as children, were separated, and years later found each other again and built a family." "It's true," agreed Emily. "Sometimes I think everything that happened was to teach us that some people are destined to be part of our lives, no matter how many twists fate takes." At that moment, Margaret arrived from school and wanted to know what they were talking about. "We're looking at old family photos," explained Benjamin. "Can I see too?" The three sat on the sofa and flipped through the photo album, reconstructing the family history through the images. "Our family has many interesting stories," commented Margaret. "And you, Margaret, do you have any interesting story to tell?" asked Emily, teasing. "I do. Yesterday at school, my friend Jessica said her parents are fighting a lot and might separate. I told her that when people truly love each other, they talk and solve their problems. And what did she say? She asked how I knew that. I said I learned from my family, which went through many difficulties, but always solved everything with love. Emily felt proud of her daughter. "You gave your friend great advice. I learned from you that family is more important than any fight." That night, Emily shared the conversation with David. "Our children have really internalized the values we tried to teach. It's rewarding to see that. They understood that family isn't perfect, but it's where we find unconditional support, and that forgiveness is always possible when there's true love." "Exactly. I think we've given them the tools to build healthy relationships." 2 years later, Benjamin graduated in engineering like his father, and Margaret decided to pursue a career in psychology. "Why psychology?" asked David. "Because I grew up in a family where I saw how people can change and heal emotionally. I want to help other people do the same." "That's a very beautiful choice, my daughter. And it's an area where our family history can be useful," added Margaret. "I understand in practice how family therapy, forgiveness, and relationship rebuilding work." On the day of Margaret's graduation, the whole family was present to applaud. Mrs. Margaret, now 75 but still active and sharp, cried with emotion seeing her granddaughter receive the diploma. "I'm so proud of my grandchildren," she said to Richard. "They've become exceptional people," he agreed. "It's the result of a family that knew how to overcome its difficulties." After the graduation, the family gathered at home for an intimate celebration. "I want to make a special toast," said Margaret, now graduated and 22. "Go ahead, my daughter," encouraged Emily. "I want to toast to our crazy and wonderful family, which taught me that it doesn't matter how we start in life, but how we choose to grow and evolve." "To our family," everyone agreed, raising their glasses. "And I want to make an announcement," Margaret continued. "What kind of announcement?" asked David, curious. "I've decided my master's thesis will be about family reconstruction after trauma and conflict, and I want to use our family as a case study." "Really?" asked Emily, surprised. "Of course, with everyone's permission and maintaining necessary anonymity, but I think our story can help other families going through similar difficulties." "It's a fantastic idea," said David. "Our story can really help other people. And it makes me proud to know our daughter wants to use our experiences to do good," added Emily. Mrs. Margaret was moved by her granddaughter's proposal. "Do you think anyone would be interested in our story?" "I'm sure, Grandma. How many families do you know that manage to turn hostility into love, abandonment into reunion, painful secrets into unity?" "When you put it like that, our story really is special," admitted Richard. "Special and inspiring," agreed Benjamin. I always thought our family should write a book. Maybe in the future, said Margaret. For now, I'll focus on the master's thesis. 3 years later, Margaret defended her thesis on family reconstruction. The work was so well received in academia that she decided to expand the topic for her doctorate. Benjamin, meanwhile, married a college classmate, a young woman named Rebecca, who was immediately welcomed by the family with the affection that was a tradition in the house. Rebecca, welcome to our crazy family, said Emily at the first dinner with her daughter-in-law. Crazy why? Asked the young woman, laughing. Because here everyone has been everyone else's enemy at some point, but now we're all best friends, explained Benjamin. How so? Benjamin briefly told the family story to his wife, who was enchanted. What a beautiful story. You're a movie family. We're a real-life family, corrected David, with real problems and real solutions. 2 years after Benjamin's marriage, he and Rebecca announced they were expecting a baby. Another grandbaby, celebrated Mrs. Margaret, who would now be a great-grandmother. And I'm going to be a great-grandfather, said Richard, beaming. Our first grandbaby, said Emily, hugging her son. And I'm going to be an aunt, celebrated Margaret. Benjamin and Rebecca's baby was born on an autumn morning. It was a boy who was given the name Gabriel Mitchell Carter. Why Gabriel? Asked Emily. Because Gabriel means strength of God, explained Rebecca, and we think our family has been blessed with a lot of strength to overcome difficulties. Mrs. Margaret, now 80, held her great-grandson with trembling but firm hands. Welcome to the family, Gabriel. You were born into a family where love always wins. Richard, 75, was also emotional, another generation to continue our story of love and forgiveness. Emily watched the scene and felt emotional as she realized how her family had grown and multiplied. From a pregnant woman threatened with eviction, she had become the matriarch of a large, close-knit family. What are you thinking about? Asked David. I'm thinking that our story proves family isn't just about biology. It's about choice, commitment, forgiveness, and unconditional love. That's true. And now we have one more person to teach these values to. Gabriel will grow up hearing the family stories, said Margaret. He'll learn from a young age that people can change and that love always finds a way. 5 years had passed. Gabriel was a cheerful and curious child, adored by the entire extended family. Margaret had completed her doctorate and now worked as a family therapist, using her academic knowledge combined with her personal experience to help other families. Benjamin and Rebecca had another child, a girl named Sophia. The house became even more lively and joyful with 2 small children running through the rooms. Mrs. Margaret, even at 85, remained active and involved. She cared for her great-grandchildren with the same dedication she had shown with her grandchildren. Richard, at 80, had developed some health issues, but he could still tell stories and play the guitar for the children. Emily, now in her 50s, had expanded the accounting firm even further. David continued to work as an engineer, but was already thinking about retirement. One Sunday afternoon, the whole family was gathered for Gabriel's 5th birthday. As the children played in the garden and the adults chatted on the porch, Emily had a realization. Do you realize our family now has 4 generations living together harmoniously? It's true, said Benjamin. Great-grandchildren, grandchildren, children, and grandparents all united. And each generation learned from the experiences of the previous ones, added Margaret. Gabriel and Sophia are growing up in a family that has already been through every possible trial, said Rebecca. They'll have the emotional tools that many children don't. And they'll know that no matter what happens in life, they'll always have a family to come back to, said David. Mrs. Margaret, listening to the conversation, smiled wisely. You know what makes me happiest in this whole story? What, Grandma? Asked Margaret. It's that we managed to turn a story that began with abandonment and hostility into a story of love and unity that will be passed down from generation to generation. How so? Look, Emily was abandoned as a child, but she became an exemplary mother. Richard abandoned the family, but he returned and became a devoted grandfather. I was a cruel mother-in-law, but I became a loving grandmother. David grew up in a broken family but built a solid one. And now Benjamin and I are raising our children on this solid foundation, added Rebecca. Exactly, said Mrs. Margaret. Every difficulty we faced served to make us better people and pave the way for the next generations. At that moment, Gabriel ran up to the porch. Grandma Margaret, can you tell that family story? Which story, my grandson? The story of how the whole family met and became united. The adults exchanged glances, realizing that the 5-year-old had already internalized the importance of the family history. Of course, my little one. Come here. Gabriel nestled in his great-grandmother's lap, and Sophia also came closer to listen. Once upon a time, there was a family that went through many adventures until they learned the secret of happiness. As Mrs. Margaret told the story to her great-grandchildren, adapting it for a child's understanding, Emily watched the scene with infinite gratitude. 30 years ago, she was a desperate pregnant woman, threatened with eviction by a hostile mother-in-law. Today she was the matriarch of a 4-generation family, where that same mother-in-law told affectionate stories to her great-grandchildren. Life really takes surprising turns, she murmured. The best stories are the ones with happy endings after many hardships, replied David, holding his wife's hand. And our story has the happiest ending I could imagine, agreed Emily. As the sun set in the garden of the house where it all began, the family remained gathered, savoring the peace and harmony they had achieved through much love, forgiveness, and determination. Gabriel and Sophia listened attentively to their great-grandmother's story, absorbing the values that would be passed down to them and in the future to their own children. The house that once was a stage for conflicts and threats now echoed with children's laughter, loving conversations among adults, and the serene wisdom of the elders. And so a story that could have ended with separation and resentment turned into a saga of love, forgiveness, and family rebuilding that would continue to be told and lived by future generations. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this moving story of overcoming and family love. Do you believe in the power of forgiveness to transform relationships? Share your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. If this narrative touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that move and inspire. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing content that makes a difference.